G'day and welcome to the Grow a Small Business Podcast. I'm your host, Troy Truen. Each week, we speak with an owner who has grown a business with 5 to 30 team members to something bigger. Diving into their numbers and unearthing the pain they've experienced, we explore what they did to overcome each barrier and what they would do differently from day one. Let's get into it.
Welcome, everyone. Today I'm interviewing Jacob Morgan, who is a 5 times best-selling author, a futurist and keynote speaker on leadership, employee experience and the future of work. And Jacob is based in Los Angeles in the USA. So thanks for your time, mate.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Looking forward to the chat. We're going to have a chat about the critical role of vulnerability in personal and business development for small business owners, and certainly something I'm passionate about because I believe it's so impactful for small business owners. And you've written a book last year titled Leading with Vulnerability, so that's we'll certainly share that in the show notes for our listeners to purchase. So to kick things off, Jacob, just give us a bit of an insight into your background.
Sure. Well, you alluded to some of the stuff that I do. So I speak at a lot of conferences and events. I write books. I have a podcast. I create content. I do a lot of research. And I really focus on how do we create future-ready leaders, employees, and organizations. And that's where all of my time is spent. I do some advisory work for various organizations as well. Been in this space for over 15 years now, and I got into it because I had terrible jobs working for other people, and I hated it and decided, why work for anybody else if I can go work for myself? And that's what I've been doing ever since.
And as a result, you've got a small business as well.
That's correct. I have a small business. My wife has a small business. She does what I do, but she focuses on customer experience, and I focus more on leadership and future of work employee experience stuff.
Yeah, awesome. And I guess you've alluded to that you've actually, interviewed and spoken to, I think, thousands of leaders around the world over the last, 15 odd years. So I guess your insights and learnings that we can talk about that apply to small businesses is just not your personal thoughts, but it's sort of a collection of many, if you like.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a lot of the stuff that applies for large organizations is also very relevant to small organizations too, because you're still dealing with people. Leadership is still important, whether you're part of a small company, a medium-sized company, or a large company. So applicable to big companies and small companies alike.
So vulnerability. So what does that mean to you in this context, and particularly in the shoes of a small business owner?
Yeah, it's a very uncomfortable topic for a lot of people. And vulnerability, in the context that most of us think about it, is this idea of exposing yourself to a gap that you have. And that inherently is not a bad thing, exposing yourself to a gap that you have. But in the context of work, it's actually not a good idea. So there's a difference between being vulnerable versus leading with vulnerability. So let me kind of unpack the difference between those two. Vulnerability is the idea of exposing yourself, exposing a gap that you have. It could be a gap in experience, a gap in capability, a gap in talent, whatever it is. Leading with vulnerability is about exposing that gap that you have, but then demonstrating what you're trying to do to close the gap. So for example, if you make a mistake at work, being vulnerable is saying, I'm sorry I made a mistake. Leading with vulnerability is saying, I'm sorry I made a mistake. Here's what I'm going to do to fix it. Here's what I learned from the mistake that I made. And here's what I'm going to do to make sure that that mistake doesn't happen again. That is crucial because, again, in the context of work, if you're vulnerable, again, your leaders, your customers, they're not going to look at you and say, gee, thank you for being vulnerable. They're going to look at you and they're going to say, well, now what? So if you have an unhappy customer and you just say, I'm sorry I made a mistake, your customer doesn't care. Your customer wants to know, okay, well, what are you going to do about it? If you go to your leader and say that you made a mistake, your leader is not going to look at you and say, oh, gee, thank you for telling me. They're going to look at you and they're going to say, well, the project is still not completed. The deadline has still not been met. The customer is still unhappy. What are you going to do about it? So that is the difference. Don't just talk about the gap that you have, but demonstrate what you are trying to actually do to close that gap. And that is specifically relevant in the context of work because you're being paid a salary. You have projects, you have customers, you have deadlines, you have a team that you're working with. So you can't just be vulnerable. You have to lead with vulnerability.
That's a very good distinction and a good starting point for this chat. So, I guess because in my experience, many small business owners, I guess, struggle with that aspect in just acknowledging sometimes vulnerability and not being the person that can do everything and as we know, that can sort of lead to micromanaging and it is very hard to grow a business with that approach. So have you got any sort of tips, if you like, to help small business owners, one, I guess, acknowledge that they have some shortcomings and that aspect of vulnerability?
Okay. So yeah, there are a few things that you can do. I mean, vulnerability is obviously uncomfortable for a lot of us. It's not something that comes naturally. It's something that we have to get used to and something that we have to practice. So one of the frameworks or tools that I have in the book is called the vulnerability mountain. And the vulnerability mountain is essentially this idea of picking a base camp and then picking a peak. Base camp is something that you can easily do tomorrow. So for example, here's what I did over the weekend. Here's something that I learned, right? That's base camp. It's easy. It's something that you can start with. The peak of the mountain for you might be talking about a personal challenge or a struggle, something that you're uncomfortable with, a mistake that you made, asking for help. Everyone's going to have a different vulnerability mountain. The thing is, once you identify what the base is and what the peak is, then you can start to take steps every day to climb that vulnerability mountain. So I think that's a very useful framework and a very useful way to think about that. The second thing is that vulnerability will be used against you at some point in your career. So I don't want people to have this assumption that, well, if I'm vulnerable, it's always going to go the way that I want it to go. In fact, for most of the leaders that I've interviewed, for most of the research that I've done, at some point, vulnerability does get used against you. Maybe somebody takes that information and keeps you from getting promoted. Maybe somebody takes information, they stab you in the back, whatever it is. The key there is to try to remember to turn those things into learning moments instead of turning those things into what I call fixed moments, which keep you from being vulnerable in the future. The reason why this is so important is because vulnerability is where growth comes from and development. So in other words, vulnerability, we all have gaps, right? The world around us is changing. So if you exist and you assume that you don't have any gaps, essentially what you're saying is, I'm perfect. I can't get better. I'm already fully capable and talented, and there's no progress. We know that that doesn't apply to anybody in the world. So when something goes not according to plan, and you basically tell yourself, I'm never going to be vulnerable again, essentially what you're saying is, I'm never going to learn again. I'm never going to grow again. I'm never going to advance again. I'm never going to do any of these things again. And that's a very dangerous and scary place to be. What's far more important is to tell yourself, what did I learn about myself, about the other person, about this situation that I can apply in the future to make sure that things have a better outcome than what they did this time?
Yeah, and sort of flipping it, so from a small business owner to their team members, I guess I'm assuming that it's important equally for a business owner to encourage vulnerability from their perspective, again, for the same reasons as you say, and to climb that vulnerability mountain and very much part of their learning curve.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. And so, a lot of the leaders that I've interviewed said that there is no learning without vulnerability. I've interviewed several researchers and psychologists who say that in academic literature, there are 22 different definitions of trust, and every single one of them have to do with vulnerability. So vulnerability is also around what creates trust. So these things are crucial. When you think about trust, learning, development, growth, not possible without vulnerability. And again, it doesn't matter if you're a small business or a large business.
Yeah, I came across a concept to help sort of open up that sort of vulnerability conversation, and part of it was for people to share a hardship in their life, which I guess gives sort of some context sometimes around decision making or actions. What are your thoughts on that sort of approach?
With anything, whether you're talking about sharing a hardship or a mistake, whatever it is, you always have to start with the intention. Why is it that you want to share what it is that you want to share? So, in the case of a hardship, what's the point of doing it? Are you trying to treat your organization like a group therapy session? If so, that's not a good idea. If you're using it as a way to create connection, if you're using it as a way to show that you are human, if you're using it as a way to highlight a leadership lesson, if you're using it as a way to build better rapport with somebody, that's fine. The point is that you need to understand why you're saying or doing whatever it is that you're saying or doing before you do it. And that's the mistake that a lot of people make, not just leaders, is they use vulnerability and they're vulnerable, but they don't think through why they're doing it and what the intended outcome is. And this is specifically relevant in the context of work. In your personal life, maybe it's not as relevant because vulnerability helps create trust and build relationships with friends, family members, your significant other, etc. But again, we have to remember in the context of work, you got hired to do a job, you're being paid a salary, like all these things really matter. And so you have to think differently from a business perspective versus a personal perspective. In the business perspective, you should have your what is the intended outcome hat on in these situations whenever you can.
Yeah, that's a very good point, and certainly a great takeaway for our listeners.
Are you struggling to find time to work on your business? Or is your health and relationships out of balance? Lost confidence, or are your weeks filled with fear? Our free 10-day Transform Your Performance online course shows you how to unlock at least 5 hours a week. We start with the secret to guaranteed success, and with over 100 lessons and free tools, you will become more focused, productive, and feel more in control of your business, health, and relationships. GrowSmallBusiness.com.
Can you share a client experience where embracing vulnerability positively impacted their business?
Oh, sure. There are lots of different stories and examples. I mean, they're from large companies, not from small ones,
Sure.
but I can still share. So one of them is from Fleetwood Grobler. He's the CEO of a South African energy company. I think they had 35,000 employees. And when he came in as CEO, the company was $13 billion in debt. The banks were about to repossess the business. It was going to go bankrupt. It was going to disappear. And his board and all the executives came to him and they said, hey, you're a new CEO here. There's a lot of stuff that's going on. Why don't you do a town hall, address the workforce and talk about what's happening to the business? And so he agreed to do that. And he started off his message by embracing vulnerability. So he talked about the challenges to the business. He talked about the difficult economic conditions. He talked about all the different challenges, the uphill climbs that the business was going to be faced with. And he also said, I don't know exactly how we're going to get out of this. Now, if he were to just stop his message there and say, thank you for joining me on this town hall, people would say, what the hell did we just hear? Like, it sounds like our CEO is freaking out, abandon ship. So he started off with vulnerability and then he added the leadership piece. And the leadership piece is, I know that we can turn things around. I know that we can be successful. I see a plan for where we can go in the future. And if you come with me on this journey, I'm sure that we'll be able to make the business successful. And that's exactly what they did. One of the reasons why I really like this story is because it shows how a leader, even of a large company, is able to bring together both vulnerability and leadership. So he's vulnerable by talking about the challenges. And then he also talks about leadership in the sense that he says, I have a vision for where this business can go. If you come with me on this journey, I believe in you and I know we can turn things around. So he's not just talking about the problems and the challenges. He's also trying to bring people on this journey to solve the problem. And that's a very different message to give. And so I think that's a pretty good example. And in my book, I have tons of different stories like that of both vulnerability and leading with vulnerability and the difference of each one.
Yeah, that's a great story and no doubt very powerful. And I guess regardless of that being a very large business, can exactly apply to small business owners.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the same thing is true for business owners, especially small ones, right? Because as small businesses, we go through our own challenges, we go through our own tough times as well. And so even though we have a smaller workforce, we still want to convey that leadership to our smaller teams too, not just talk about the challenges and the problems and this and that. We also want to convey opportunity. We want to convey leadership, and we want to get people to move in that right direction.
That's right. And at the end of the day, it's got to be a team effort. And to your point, everybody rowing in the same direction. Otherwise, it's just creates more challenges than you need.
Exactly. You don't want people jumping ship because they're scared of the message that you're delivering.
Yes, absolutely. So what are some sort of common misconceptions about vulnerability in leadership and business?
Well, one of the things that we asked 14,000 employees in a leadership survey that I did with a firm called DDI, they're a big leadership firm. So we surveyed 14,000 employees and we said, what's the number one reason why you are not vulnerable at work? Or what's the number one reason that keeps you from being vulnerable at work? And the number one response we got back is, I don't want to be perceived as being weak or incompetent. And then the question becomes, well, how can I be vulnerable without being perceived as being weak or incompetent? And the way that you do that is you add competence or leadership to the vulnerability, which is exactly what we've been talking about this whole time. So if you don't want to be perceived as being weak, then don't just talk about the gaps, right? Don't just say, I made a mistake. I'm sorry. I need help. I don't know. I'm struggling. Don't just talk about that stuff. Add the leadership piece. Here's how I'm solving the problem. Here's what I'm doing. Here's some options that I have. Here's some potential solutions I'm going to be looking at. Here's what I learned. When you add that to the vulnerability, you change the perception that people have of you. People will no longer look at you as being weak or incompetent. They'll look at you as somebody who is learning, who is growing, and who is developing. So the answer to how can I be vulnerable without being perceived as incompetent, the answer to that question is in the question itself. Add competence to the vulnerability, and that will help solve that problem for a lot of people. So the misconception is that you can't do that. And the other misconception is that anything related to vulnerability means weakness and incompetence and this and that, but that's not true. I think we need to reframe vulnerability as where learning and growth and trust comes from.
Yes, because I think with many small business owners, they have that mindset of sort of needing to maintain authority and confidence, and that not being vulnerable undermines that. So how can small business owners sort of balance the aspect of vulnerability with maintaining authority and confidence?
So it goes back to a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about. So I call it the vulnerable leader equation, and it's leadership plus vulnerability equals leading with vulnerability. So whenever there's moments of vulnerability, I always tell leaders, see what you can do to add leadership to the equation. And I think that's probably the best piece of advice I can give to anybody is try to add leadership to any of those moments of vulnerability. And that will reframe how people perceive you. It'll reframe how your messages come across, and it'll reframe, I think, the team dynamics and the team engagement as well. And the other piece that I alluded to earlier is to ask yourself about the intention of vulnerability. What is the purpose behind it? What is the outcome that you're striving to achieve? And I think if you can do those things along with building that vulnerability mountain that we've talked about, you'll very much be on the right track.
Yes, I like that. And so as a sort of adjunct to that, what are some practical steps that small business owners can take to sort of cultivate a culture of vulnerability within their teams?
Well, I think number one is you lead by example, right? I mean, you can't tell people that you work with, hey, be vulnerable or lead with vulnerability. It comes from you as the leader, leading by example. So I think the number one thing that you can do is if you want your team to lead with vulnerability, then you have to lead with vulnerability. I think the second thing is make sure to convey the competence piece with the vulnerability. That's, I think, a big struggle that a lot of leaders have is they oftentimes talk about vulnerability and they leave out the leadership and the competence piece. So make sure that as a leader, if you're talking about vulnerability, still talk about merit, competence, doing a good job, high quality work. You don't want vulnerability to be used as a way to justify poor performance, right? That's never a good idea. So I think those are probably two starting points. And maybe the third one that we talked about again is to encourage everyone to have the intention of why it is that they want to be vulnerable. And I think if you can do those three things, you'll very much be on the right track. But by far, the number one thing that your people are going to be looking for from you is to know that it's okay, to know that it's accepted, and to know that it's respected in the organization. So if you start doing it as a leader, your people will start doing it as well.
Yeah, that's fantastic, and I think a good way to finish this chat, Jacob. It's been very insightful on a topic that's so important for business owners. I think large or small, and appreciate your insights that have been, I think, hopefully powerful for our listeners. And we'll leave in our show notes reference to your book, and I know you've got a newsletter. We'll reference that as well for our listeners. And again, thank you very much for sharing some time.
Thank you for having me.
We'd greatly appreciate you taking a couple of minutes to leave our podcast a review on iTunes. If you don't have an account, simply follow us on Spotify. You'll help other small business owners find the cast and valuable content our guests share.